Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to another episode of the Ummahtimes, where we help decolonize minds. We are your hosts Ali and Zishan, and today we have a special guest on our show who will try to help decolonize our understanding of the past and present global events. And our guest is none other than Brother David Livingstone. Brother David is a scholar and investigator for over 30 years in the area of occult influence in history. He is author of several books, including The Dying God, The Hidden History of Western Civilization, Terrorism and the Illuminati, A 3,000-Year History, and Black Terror, White Soldiers, Islam, Fascism, and the New Age. And his most recent book is Transhumanism, The History of a Dangerous Idea. Assalamu alaikum, Brother David, and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
That's great. We've been anticipating this discussion for a long time, and we really look forward to hearing about your findings in the history of the occult and its connection to present-day major global events. But before you share your insights on your interesting research, to say the least, for the benefit of the viewers, we'd like to get to know you a little more. We also understand your embracing of Islam earlier in your life coincided with your interest in research in this area of history. If you could kind of share that with us and our viewers, yeah, you can go ahead.
So first, I'd like to say, because it's going to put some background to it, I just want to say thank you for having me on the show. That I've been at this for 30 years, and these are my first interviews with Muslims.
I believe we're the second, aren't we?
Wow.
You're the third.
Third, okay,
Third,
all right.
okay.
Yeah.
So we'll take third place.
That speaks a lot to it speaks a lot to the reasons why I came to Islam, of what this situation of Islam is. Because for when I'm speaking to non-Muslims, I refer to this as the history of the occult, right? But the reality is, what I'm researching is not a chosen discipline. It's not because I'm particularly interested in the occult itself, but it's because what I'm researching is the history of humanity. In short, the history of the situation that the Muslims are in. I'm researching this to understand the world that we live in, to understand my obligation as a Muslim. Before I can act, I have to understand the circumstances that I'm living in. I think this is kind of a point that Muslims lose, is that they think that they could just read the Quran, and we'll probably get into some of these points, but they understand Sharia, that it's sort of a set of rules and obligations that apply in any situation, but they don't. You have to first analyze the situation you're living in so that you can apply the rules. So before we can determine how we're going to act, before we're going to determine how we're going to decolonize ourselves, is by first understanding the situation that we're living in. So that's pretty much what I've been doing. So that's why my path to this point of having come to Islam and studied this information is because they're one and the same, right? What I was originally looking for was the truth, and it's when I found Islam that I knew that I had the core truth, the underlying truth, both the ideological truth, but also the basic historical truth, which was that there's a creator who created the universe, that creator has communicated with humanity, that he has revealed several books, that the Torah and the Injil are among several of those books, which basically for me tied biblical history, because there was a lot, of course, to biblical history which is skeptical, or you should be skeptical about. So the Quran basically put that into context so I could see how there was an original truth to it, despite the fact that it's been altered. And then to get a sense of what the original message would have been, and to better understand, because there's a certain purity to the message of Islam, especially specifically to understand the nature of God and how he communicates and what his laws are. So that's in the Torah and the Injil, but of course it's been corrupted. And it's only because, we're born with this innate sense of the truth. So it's like, polishing the pearl or the diamond. That's basically, Islam helps you to get away with that crust, so that what you eventually see is what I originally felt deep down was the truth.
It's kind of like,
So,
it's kind of like a filter. It's the filter, right? You look at it
yeah,
that way.
yeah. So so my search didn't really stop. Once I had the original, the core truth, I wanted to understand, the world we're living in, and to see what has been God's plan. What do we do in our time? How do we solve the situation that we're living in? The only way to do that is to, again, we call it the occult, but it's not the history of the occult. It's the history, we might all jump to the point. It's the history of the satanic Luciferian conspiracy. And as I mentioned, basically is that, I lost my point. It's the history, let me say, it's the history of the satanic conspiracy. So, right, my point was that what Muslims seem to have forgotten, like what I've seen over the last, 3 decades, is that Muslims tend to shy away from conspiracy discussion. They find it a little too controversial, maybe a little embarrassing. And but the reality is that the message of Islam is that we are living in a conspiracy. Right? If we can sum up the history of humanity very briefly, that God created man. He asked Iblis to bow down before Adam. He refused, so God gave him until the day of judgment to test humanity. History of the world in 3 sentences. That's the world. That's the world we're living in. So we need to. The thing is, I guess Muslims also assumed, and I think maybe this could all have been revealed once we were able to look back on what happened. But we kind of assumed that Iblis goes from person to person, trying to mislead them, on various sort of more immediate issues. But what seems to have happened is that there is a, I'm not sure exactly how it's coordinated because there's no revelation to that point. But there's clearly first of all, there's a set of beliefs, which is what Western scholars call the occult. It's a specific group of sort of quasi-religious magical beliefs that have remained coherent since at least the 6th century BC, and they have been perpetuated since that time by a lot of people who have become famous. More recently in versions of modern versions of Western history, and have managed to preserve these beliefs over time. Sometimes they've been interrelated. Many times they have operated with various groups who have been interconnected somehow across many empires and civilizations. And then you can see how these beliefs have been retained right up until our time, particularly to Rosicrucianism and finally Freemasonry. So, the thing is that there's the facade that is presented to us, on CNN and CNBC and the MSNBC, CBS, whatever. Even, of course, the university system. There's this facade that basically creates a set of facts that are there to occupy us in a certain framed debate. But that debate is a distraction, and it's nowhere near the truth. It's basically designed to keep us away from the truth. The only way to get to the truth of how we got here is to understand the history of the occult, because the people who have shaped the world politically, at least in the last 300 years, have been devoted to this tradition that I trace back to the 6th century. And the most important clue that got me there was Surat al-Baqarah, verse 102 to 103.
Yeah, and I just want to comment on that. Like, it's true that, like, they've there's a facade that's being carried, and a lot of people, including Muslims, have kind of accepted it. And like you mentioned in, I think, in one of your books, that this is all kind of led to the rule of secularism, right? And the thing is, if you're not ruling, if there's no rule by the truth or by the creator, then it's
whatever you want to make it.
It's Satan then, right? That's but what I think what's happened is a lot of people have said, oh, secularism is a neutral group. It's a neutral way of organizing society. No, it's not. If you take God out of the equation, then it's a satanic system, right?
Yeah.
And I think, for me, and I don't know about Ali, that also took time for me to realize as well. Like back when I was younger, I thought, oh, secularism, yeah, it's a neutral system where everyone, it's not satanic. You can't say that. But again, when we go back to the Quran, it acts as that filter and kind of, as you said, it polishes it up, gets rid of the dirt, and you get that clear understanding. But if you don't mind, Brother David, I just want to backtrack a little and just tell us a little bit about your story and how you came across Islam and how you kind of embraced it.
It's a pretty simple story. I mean, I was searching for the truth since I was a kid. I often tell the story of how I was about 7, I think, and I overheard my parents talk about Socrates and Plato when they had some guests over. And after the guests left, I asked my parents, like, who are these guys you're talking about? Who's Socrates and Plato? And I was so, oh, well, these are guys who are trying to figure out the truth. And then it hit me as, we don't know what the truth is. It seemed awfully surprising. Like, here we have, several billion people living on this planet. We don't know what the truth is. And we've been at this for, several thousand years. So, I said, I'm going to try to see if I can figure it out. So I was always trying to think about things, analyze it, get to the truth. And, but it became more focused when I was probably in my late teens, early 20s. And, I kind of varied. I have to, sorry to admit that there was a point when I was an atheist. And of course, if there is no God, then there's no truth, and I really got to the sort of the Nietzschean abyss, I recognize the ultimate reality that if there's no God, there's no truth, which means that there's no meaning to existence. And there was only so long that could make sense. And I got to a point when finally, because having been raised in the part of the world that I have, the examples of Christianity that I saw were pretty bad. Of course, I used to see the televangelists on TV, and for me, those guys were clearly insincere, and I didn't want to have anything to do with whatever they had to do with. So I had the same prejudice as most people, is I bulked in Christians with Christianity, and I mistook what they were preaching with what was the truth of religion, which it isn't. So I finally got to the point where I learned to understand what God means. The way I explain it is that God is a word for a reality, and you have to understand. People just argue about, does God exist, and the problem is they need to understand, what does the word mean. And that's what I got to the point where I finally understood what people were referring to, and it wasn't the old man in the sky with a beard and a robe, as I had been told to. And so once I did that, I sort of more immediately inclined to Christianity, because was closer to my upbringing. And I started reading the Bible, particularly the New Testament. A lot of things started to make sense to me. And I came to it in a roundabout way. I wanted to read as many scriptures as possible. I wasn't set on Christianity itself. And I read the Bhagavad Gita, and it recommended the importance of prayer. So I thought to myself, I saw how Muslims pray, so I'm gonna look into look into Islam and see what I can learn from it. And I was shocked to see, I have to admit again, my gross ignorance, that I had no idea that Islam was part of the same biblical tradition as Judaism and Christianity. I had no idea that Jesus was the prophet of Islam, that Solomon, David, and just the fact that it showed that there was this continuous message that had been revealed throughout history, for me, just immediately became apparent as the truth. And it's just that simple. It was just the simplicity of seeing that that's what the problem had been, that there had been a message being revealed all this time, but that it had been corrupted over time. Mm-hmm. And that fortunately there was this one revelation which cleared things up, and it certainly did. Like I said, that there's two fundamental elucidations that the Quran shares, and one of them is that the Bible has been corrupted, because people, what's unfortunate, the challenge to Christians is that either the Bible is all true or it isn't. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. So if you challenge them on points that are seen, pretty suspicious, they get very defensive because they feel that they have to accept the entirety of it, otherwise their whole faith is in question. And so it allows, that point allows us to see that there's a truth there, but a lot of it is gone. And then secondly, that Jesus was a man. Yeah. And not a son of God, because what was really important for me, and likely for most people, is that we need to get back to this. Sometimes it's so simplistic, some of our history, mine in particular. The one idea of God that struck me was from Star Wars. Right? The idea of a force. And when I saw that movie, I was only 10 years old when I saw that movie. I thought, yeah, that's kind of more what I have in mind. Something less identifiable, that's something less tangible. Like more of a living power. And so, of course, I don't want to say Islam, is close to Star Wars, but of course, it's an idea that's at least more abstracted. It's less tied to these mystical ideas like Christianity. It makes it. Of course, it's our fitra, so yes, it aligns with our fitra, and I want to say it's more believable, but it becomes recognizable.
Mm-hmm. You know what? It's very interesting because it's safe to say that you basically came to Islam through self-study, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So there are not many. I know very few people who embraced Islam based on just self-study. It's usually, they get introduced to Islam through acquaintances or friends, or even attending some sort of lectures or events. But you just came on, because the thing is, I think what happens is this society keeps you so busy that it kind of discourages you to be self-reflective, right? And there's very few people who kind of detach themselves from the whole kind of busyness and noise of society, and are willing to self-reflect. So it kind of shows that you came through Islam through that means. So you grew up. I guess you grew up in Montreal, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now I want to add anything to that, Oli? Any questions on?
No, go on.
No. Okay. Great. So what I wanted to kind of get into is when I look at some of your writings and some of your interviews as well. You basically what you've this is very kind of like putting this in a very nutshell. You can't compare. I'm not kind of outlining all of your work here or anything like that. But in a nutshell, what you're saying is that basically there's been a conspiracy of people getting together, siding with the shaitan, basically, either intentionally or not in an organized way or in an organized way. And then you had these various movements like the Templars. I think it's the
Rosicrucians.
Yeah, and then
the
the Freemasons, and then the Illuminati, that what we're dealing with right now.
Mm-hmm.
if I want, we're more kind of interested to knowing how, and obviously you're going to go into the history a little more on that to kind of illustrate that point, how they kind of infiltrated segments in Islamic civilization and history. If you can kind of touch on that.
Yeah, so that's an important point. Thanks for asking. I think if we can, I'll start from today quickly to put it in context. But the reality is, I think there's been an estimate. I'm going to speak frankly. I hope I can, but some people might find this controversial. But the reality is that the estimates I've seen, and we've probably seen it most in our daily lives, that up to 80% of the mosques in North America are Saudi funded. And, it's, so the Saudis, of course, follow, I would characterize them as a sect. I characterize Wahhabism as a sect. They have called themselves Sunni. I think that that's a ruse. They have effectively redefined what it means to be Sunni to allow themselves to be considered Sunni. So by dominating the discussion, they basically have prevented people from ascertaining of how false that is. And of course, the Saudi family were installed in 1932 with assistance from the British. A year later, 1933, is when they signed their first concessions to Rockefeller Standard Oil. And that's basically what incepted the modern history. So, the Wahhabis hadn't participated in World War II necessarily, not directly like the Sharif of Mecca did, to fight the legitimate Ottoman Empire. But they did take advantage of the vacuum when the Sharif was removed, and then to accept British assistance in claiming the peninsula for their own. I just happened to read yesterday that there's only one absolute monarchy in the world. I believe there's only one, and the Saudi Arabia is one of them. Mm-hmm. And so they never did anything of their own. Their wealth was handed to them, and had been handed to them basically throughout the century. People speak. It's a well-known refrain that most of the world's wars are fought for oil. Well, 30% of that oil comes from Saudi Arabia. So, the majority of the suffering in the world in the 20th century, the Saudis have been indirectly responsible for by largely providing the resources that allowed those funds to be accumulated to carry out most of what's happening in the 20th century. So the Rockefellers orchestrated, the Rockefellers basically commandeered the American educational system, and that's how they created the Western civilization course and created this basically propaganda version of Western history. John D. Rockefeller turned to charity, much like Bill Gates did, and created all kinds of tax-exempt foundations. The CIA had two primary sources of funding, or covert funding, and that was from the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. So most of the CIA's covert operations, from MK Ultra to assassinating people like Mossadegh or Allende in Chile, most of it, I guess, it's support for research into computers, and most recently, largely the environmental movement was which the Rockefellers have been behind. All that has come from their profits out of the oil, our oil, that has been sucked out of the ground in Saudi Arabia, in very close proximity to the Haramain. Right? It's a catastrophic obscenity, and Muslims are completely in the dark about it. So the consequences are that by dominating Islamic culture, what we're living in now is Muslims are completely basically removed from their true legal scholarly heritage. So what we have today is we have a kind of debate, which is, without people knowing, it's essentially a Wahhabi Salafi kind of debate, because it's a debate about Islam where, in fact, we don't have scholars in our time. The Hadith, the Prophet clearly said that he doesn't remove knowledge, he removes knowledgeable people. And I believe that's the situation that we live in. So the books are all there. They're all gathering dust in the libraries. Instead, we have celebrities who are celebrated as scholars, quote unquote scholars. They are not scholars. They have had maybe a bachelor degree, which is nothing, from some, a university, usually in Medina or Mecca, which doesn't qualify them in any way as having the skills necessary to be providing leadership to the Muslims. And instead, they have been given basically a few, samplings of information, largely framed around the Wahhabi outlook, and that becomes what they perpetuate. So the problem there is that the true heritage, scholarly heritage, what happened to me is that I was surrounded by Salafis as well too when I first came to Islam, and I have to admit that I got sucked into them as well. When I eventually, it became clear to me that they were, I have to say, a Zionist plot. And at that point, I thought I decided I wanted to figure out what is then the truth. If that hasn't been the truth all this time, then what is the true path of Sunnism? And it actually took me a couple of years until I got to the point where I realized it had been under our noses the whole time. And that is to follow a madhab, which of course is precisely what Salafism and Wahhabism is out to undermine. So I can get to the long-term history of how that's happened. So basically, to be part of Ahlul Sunnah wa Jama'ah, to be a Sunni means to follow the scholarly tradition of Sunnism. It's not based on the choice of the Caliph. It happens to be that the tradition under which this scholarly tradition developed was under rule that was descended from the four caliphs, but it's not intertwined. So that's not the basis of it. And the basis of it is forced legal schools. So we have to understand that in the beginning, as Islamic scholarship exploded, Muslims started to gather all the information that was available because their legal questions became more and more complex. And they needed as much background as they could gather to try to help them solve this situation, because they weren't necessarily directly answered in the Quran, or they weren't directly answered in the Hadith, and they had to make certain inferences. So, the beauty in Islam, unlike what we have today, is that if I say I'm supposed to have my hands over my belly rather than my chest, I'm not called a heretic, right? Where this is how the Wahhabis are trying to confine the debate to their particular approach. In the past, we had multiple approaches because the scholars recognize that, yes, you could see it that way, and I have to accept that you might have a point. I don't agree with you, but you have a point. You've demonstrated that you have the knowledge, the experience necessary to justify your interpretation, and so we'll accept that interpretation is legitimate. So this kind of debate could have gone on forever, but it was decided for the sake of Islam, because right now the Salafis are returning us to these debates again. But these debates, where you put your hands in prayer, where you put your feet, this is not is going to get us out of this mess. This is not where the debate should be. These debates were resolved a long time ago, and we couldn't go on debating about these things for centuries. So it was decided, what was it, probably in the 10th century? I'm sorry, excuse my lack of historical accuracy if that's not the case, but it was decided to close the doors of ijtihad, right? And that means that it doesn't mean that all debate is henceforth going to be stopped, but that the necessary points of the law had been thoroughly debated, and it was decided it's best to stop and cease it here, and then we can move on to, bigger issues.
So basically what you're saying is that the laws of jurisprudence that were extracted from the Quran and Sunnah, it was exhausted so much that you don't have to go on. It's so exhausting.
Forever.
Why bother opening, quote unquote, the can of worms again?
Exactly.
I could see your point. I could see your point on that.
Yeah.
Go on, because I'm very
Right.
curious, because you mentioned how in your previous lectures you mentioned how certain elements of I guess the Templars, how they kind of how they infiltrated certain Muslims and etc. So yeah, if you can kind of elaborate on that. Yeah.
Right. So
sorry, David. Before you continue,
yeah,
also
sure.
just want to add on to what Zishan has said, but also at the same time, we'll be talking about the Wahhabism and the Saudis, and obviously they use Ibn Taymiyyah,
That's
as one of their,
Shaykh al-Islam.
Shaykh al-Islam, right? They put him on a pedestal, and they use his quote unquote teachings or his material,
his
to
attack
propagate
on the tradition.
Exactly, exactly mock up the tradition and present a different strand of Islam, right?
That's right.
If you could touch base on that as well while you're answering, so I think it'll be beneficial for our viewers.
That's exactly where I was hoping to go next.
Right.
So it's important to understand that the closing of ijtihad doesn't mean that ijtihad no longer happens, but it means that you have to have a certain depth of knowledge to be able to make use of it, and that knowledge is formidable, right? So you're expected. There are just different lists, but you're expected to have memorized 1 million hadith. You have to have in-depth knowledge of the Arabic language, in-depth knowledge of the life of the Prophet, the biographies of each of the narrators in the chains of hadith, and that's just the tip of it, right? So you can see that there's nobody in our time who can claim that degree of knowledge. If they did, then yes, they could challenge Shafi and Ibn Hanbal and Abu Hanifa and so on, but they cannot. And this is the tragedy that we're living in, and that's the kind of knowledge that needs to be resurrected. So to get to the question you guys are mentioning, so the first attack on this again came from Ibn Taymiyyah, and so we need to rewind a little bit because we need to understand the context that he lived in. So as I mentioned, it's Surat al-Baqarah that explains that magic was communicated to a group of Jews that had apostatized. This happened in Babylon, and that can be traced to the 6th century BC. What that's referring to is the advent of the Hebrew Kabbalah, the Jewish Kabbalah, which is basically a form of Satanism. It presents itself as a form of mystical tradition within Judaism, but it's basically a heresy that has tried to infiltrate and ultimately hijack the legitimate Jewish religion. So that magical tradition was known in ancient times as the cult of the Magi and became famous throughout the ancient world. It was brought to when the Jews were allowed to return to Israel and rebuild their temple. Some of them went to Greece and some of them went to Egypt. In Greece, they developed the Greek philosophy, particularly that of Plato and Pythagoras, who are widely believed to have studied under the Magi. And then in Egypt, it contributed to what's called Hermeticism. And so in the city of Alexandria, it converged with mystical Judaism, particularly the mysteries of Merkaba, which is basically throne mysticism, and developed the cult of Gnosticism and Christianity, which ultimately, that's where the idea of Jesus as the Son of God came from. And it was married to what were called ancient mysteries, most importantly, the mysteries of Mithras. So ultimately, Christianity, when the Christian doctrine was imposed at the Council of Nicaea in 333, is basically rebranded according to the basic doctrines of the mysteries of Mithras. So this was basically all one cult. It was many aspects of one single Kabbalistic tradition. So that survived after the fall of the Roman Empire. It survived in the city of Haran in southeastern Turkey. The people who practice it, so basically they're the ones who resurrected the teachings of the Greek philosophers as well as Hermeticism, but they equate, well, not yet. So when Sultan, I believe is Al-Ma'mun, came to their community, he asked them to announce which people of the book they belong to, or if not, they would have to either pay jizya or convert to Islam. So they took a couple of days to think about it, and they decided that they were going to say that they were Sabians, because of course in the Quran, the Sabians are one of the people of the book, but the Sabians are actually people who come from, I believe, the Queen of Sheba. So these are fraudulent Sabians, and this was explained by Al-Biruni, an Islamic scholar. And so in reality, they were a community, an occult community, that had maintained the teachings of Neoplatonism and Hermeticism. So Ibn Taymiyyah, so the Sabians were crucial to the infiltration of occultism in Islam. They were revered throughout the Middle East by all occultists. I want to call them Muslim occultists because they were occultists, sometimes disguising themselves as Muslim, particularly the Ismailis.
Yeah.
So and the Ismailis contributed to an organization called Ikhwan al-Safa. Ikhwan al-Safa wa Qulan al-Marwa. I can't remember how to translate the whole word, but they're usually referred to as the Brethren of Sincerity or the Brethren of Purity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it wasn't like they were the Brethren of Purity. Like what I read about them was that the reason that they were a secret group is because they were clamped down. Wasn't that true by the Caliph? Because they had to watch themselves. From what I
am sure they did.
Yeah.
They were pretty out there. So they were the crucial link to the survival of occultism in Islam. They out of them came the Sufis, and as I said, they basically contributed to the doctrine. Well, they were developed by they were Ismailis. So one very important person along here in this history, especially to modern occult history, especially the one that parallels Islamic terrorism in the 20th century, is the Qadriya, the followers of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. So, I refer to in my book, there's a Jewish scholar who said that that the tomb or the mosque dedicated to Jilani actually used to be a synagogue, and that Jilani had originally was actually a famous Jewish Talmudist. And so I've been criticized for using a Jewish source to claim that Jilani was Jewish. I'm not. I'm just using that as a curiosity to show that, in some circles, Jilani's heresy is openly recognized. But he was definitely controversial in his own time, as much Sufism. And, a very important exponent of Jilani was Ibn Taymiyyah.
That's very interesting. It's very interesting you mentioned that, because I remember back in my, brief studies of critique of Sufism, there are some interesting quotes by the scholars of the schools of law you mentioned, right? Imam Malik and etc. That they actually disparaged the belief of Sufism. Now the thing is, like, there are people who say, well, there's Sufism which is as long as it's within the rules of Sharia, it's fine and all that. What's your comment on that?
I won't comment on it.
All right, you won't comment on it.
It's too
Okay.
deep a subject. I don't have the expertise to comment on it.
But what
All
you
I
know
know
that
is that there's
at least a certain strand of Sufism
is clearly heretical.
Clearly heretical, which we agree. Obviously, there is heretical Sufism. Yes.
Yeah. So that starts with Al-Halaj, right? So basically, Jilani was a student of Al-Halaj who declared that he is God, right? But he was saying, indirectly, didn't mean that he, whatever. It's clearly heretical. So Ibn Taymiyyah was born in Haran, the city of the Sabians. And what's interesting is that when you look at the history of Kabbalah, there's a mystery to it because there's certain modern scholars of Kabbalah. The most famous one is a guy named Gershom Scholem. And then more recently, there's a few more. The most famous who's still alive today is Moshe Idel. And another one is Nathaniel Deutsch. So all of them have studied the same basic mystery. And that is the Kabbalah appears suddenly in the late 13th century. And they all ask themselves, how can that be? Because the Kabbalah represents a set of Gnostic doctrines that had basically disappeared for approximately 1,000 years up until that point. So where did it survive in the meantime? So one of my claims is that the Templars discovered texts when they took over the temple. They were able to conduct excavations in the temple. That's been proven. But the other side story is that some of this Gnostic tradition survived amongst the Sabians. There's another community known as the Mandaeans. And there's a lot of debate as to whether the Sabians and the Mandaeans are one and the same. I've seen arguments both for and against, and I tend to believe that they were one and the same. Mandaeans would, of course, basically revere John the Baptist, which is a tradition that was inherited by the Templars. And so it's long believed that the Templars came in contact with Sabians, Ismailis, assassins, or if they came in contact with assassins, they basically indirectly came in contact with the same Sabian tradition, right? So what these modern scholars are saying is that this tradition, this occult Kabbalist tradition, survived amongst the Mandaeans through that interim period of almost 1,000 years. One of the basic clues of the affinity between the Mandaean teachings and the Kabbalistic teachings is anthropomorphism. Right? Particularly, there's a Kabbalist tradition known as the Shir Koma, which is, I think it translates as measure of the body. Mm-hmm. So these texts would go on, elaborately about the measurements of God's limbs and his size and his, so I wonder if it's not a coincidence that the fundamental inclination that pitted Ibn Taymiyyah against the ulama of his time was his anthropomorphism. Mm. And it's that anthropomorphism which was being inherited by the Salafis, because they fundamentally teach an anthropomorphic doctrine, whether they accept it or not. They believe that God lives above the skies. This is the Christian idea. This is Christian idea of God living above, right, overhead. This is the idea of the Christian God comes from Michelangelo. And Michelangelo, when he painted God in the Sistine Chapel, he was actually painting the Ancient of Days, and it's a Kabbalistic concept. The Ancient of Days, actually, this is crucial. I'm probably going off on too much of a tangent, but it's crucial to the history of the occult because that's Saturn, and Saturn is Satan. So that's why he's showed as an old man. So God, the Quran says that God lives beyond, right? It doesn't say there's no direction. And so this is one of the key points when you look at the ulama. They clearly say that God lives formless and without a direction. And it's crucial. And I also was saying about how I came to Islam is because what was so drawing was this pure idea of God, without all these accoutrements that other people have added to it, particularly. And I read from the Salafis, I had trouble with this for a long time about their insistence that God is, they often refer to this one hadith of a slave girl that the Prophet questioned, and he asked her, "Where's God?" And she pointed her finger upwards. But this is apparently a weak hadith. It's certainly not a doctrine that's anywhere repeated in the scholarly heritage.
Yeah, but like, if I may, just in defense of just playing the devil's advocate here, I know some I think many Salafis would say, well, yeah, he has a hand, but it's not like our hand. They'll use argumentation like that.
Of course.
You probably heard of that, right?
Of course. Yeah. I'm not sure who it was. It's one of the imams said, to say so is kufr.
Mm-hmm.
To say he has an attribute and it's not like the other attributes. To say he has a hand, but it's not like you. It's been denounced as kufr.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's also interesting that actually while we're talking about Ibn Taymiyyah, because when I was reading a few years ago Ibn Battuta's travelogue, he mentions in his travelogue very explicitly that when he was in Damascus, he met Ibn Taymiyyah there, and he referred to me as someone, someone cuckoo, right? I think he used that word.
Screw loose.
And sorry?
Screw loose.
Yeah, screw loose, exactly. And so he basically, kind of brushes it off that there were some people gathered around him, and this was, some guy with the screw loose, right? And then he just kind of, heard, a few things he had to say, was not really, was kind of taken aback because Ibn Battuta was obviously, Maliki, and he has a Maliki, from a Madhabi perspective, upbringing and the worldview. So he was quite shocked. He mentions very clearly in his travelogue, it's now after the fact that he's been, put up on a pedestal, by the Wahhabi sect, which is quite obvious.
Exactly. So it's interesting history. In fact, I think it's Ibn Battuta who describes that Ibn Taymiyyah descended the 3 steps of the minbar and said that when God descends from the heavens, he descends like this.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you're saying is that idea of anthropomorphism, Ibn Taymiyyah got from his teachers or teacher's teacher, you're saying?
Well, no, I don't know where he got it from. I'm just saying that it's a curious coincidence that he's from Haran, which is basically the birthplace, the source of the Kabbalistic anthropomorphic teachings. And even the cult tradition just swirls all around him. Not only that, but he basically revered everybody. The Salafis have difficulty with it, but Ibn Taymiyyah was an open Sufi, and he referred to Jilani as the greatest sheikh.
I see.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that because you spoke about the Jilani as well and his teacher, but at the same time, even within the Salafi scholars, modernist contemporary scholars, I mean, the tafsir of Jalalain, right? It's basically it's looked at as something which is very reliable and which should be studied, right? So now, I mean, we're talking about the connections of these so-called scholars, with different cult forces, and now an average Muslim, who's been basically taught otherwise, he basically has to go out and for example, look into your work or do the due diligence, right, to basically connect the dots. Right. But it seems like it's quite a chaotic and messy situation we find ourselves in, because an average Muslim does not know or does not have the ability to go out and conduct all this research on his or her own.
Right. Which is exactly what the Prophet foretold, right? That the problem is not that it's not that knowledge is not taken away, the scholars are gone. That's what we're missing. We don't have scholars in our time. These people that are on YouTube and pulling on these long-winded speeches, they're not scholars. We don't have I don't know of a scholar in our time. Yeah. I'm still looking. Yeah. Of that caliber, of the proper caliber, who's following the rigors as they're supposed to.
And I know, I mean, we will obviously switch gears a little bit as well, but I know we'll talk about it eventually. Obviously, Ottoman was a legitimate Khalifa, and obviously, Wahhabis, backstabbed the Khalifa. So the shield has been lost since 1924 or 1918, depends how you look at it. I mean, I want to switch gears to that as well, and maybe how this kind of all plays into the situation we are in right now. Is it due to the lack of the shield, right? Which is the Khalifa, and if it is, which is obvious it is,
Mhm.
was there any infiltration, from these occults into the Khalifa system as well, or not? At the same time, how do we actually move forward now, looking and studying the history to basically, bring about the Islamic polity, so we can at least that way,
Yeah.
absolve or clear out all this
Yeah.
this mess we in.
So if we can, I would like to if we could talk about the how the tradition of Ibn Taymiyyah was revived by
Yeah.
Yeah,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. Yep.
and then
Yes.
that
Please,
link
please.
with
Yeah.
the Muslim Brotherhood and so on.
Yes,
Yeah, that
definitely.
would be
Yeah.
interesting.
Right. So Ibn Taymiyyah was ultimately, there was a lot of debate, but he was denounced as, let's say, a heretic or not to be followed. Right.
Okay. All right.
Right.
It was basically,
Understood.
there was a lot of debate. So of course, in his time, he was jailed because of his
Views.
His views. Yeah.
many times, and there was quite some debate for a time. But actually, eventually, he was, firmly denounced and then essentially forgotten for several centuries. What happened is that Ibn Abdul Wahhab was the one to revive him. In fact, Abdul Wahhab begins a movement called revivalism. That's how Western scholars refer to it. So Ibn Taymiyyah is a curious character. Ibn Abdul Wahhab is an interesting character. So there's a well-known book that circulated in the internet called The Memoirs of Mr. Hempfer. Right? This was apparently given to, I think it was Der Spiegel, a German magazine, for publication. I checked. I wrote to them to ask them if they had ever published such a copy. They said they didn't. But there was a book in the Ottoman Empire in the late 1800s that claimed the same. It claimed that Wahhab had been a British spy in the service of, or had been in contact in the service of this British spy named Hempfer. So it's not a unique claim, but it doesn't matter. I mean, that, I think the Hempfer memoir is fascinating because it gives a potential insight, regardless of whatever is claimed there. What's clear is the radical orientation of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. The two we know are that he legitimized kingship, and what he did is that he revived the anti-madhab rationalizations of Ibn Taymiyyah. So, we have to remember that what's important is that, you mentioned the shield, but the shield is the madhabs are the shield. The closing of the doors of ijtihad is our shield. And so if you want to rewrite Islam, because Islam, is incorruptible. You can't, if you want to try to manipulate Muslims in a particular political direction, you can't do it using Orthodox Islam. The only way to do it is basically to create some kind of heresy. But if you want to rewrite Islam itself, the only way you can do that is by reopening the doors of ijtihad. So that's what Ibn Abdul Wahhab was not able to do, but began. And so this is a tradition that becomes really advanced by Jamaluddin al-Afghani. So this is where the history gets particularly interesting. So the Illuminati is the group that's, in fact, people refer to the Illuminati pretty loosely. The Illuminati were disbanded in 1785. They re-emerged in different forms, mainly what are called reading societies, various reading societies. They re-emerged as the communist movement, particularly through the Carbonari in the 1800s. But the Illuminati itself, if we don't talk about the Illuminati, like the YouTube version of Illuminati, was only really just one of many groups. And there were more important ones. One of the most important was the tradition of Martinism. And that survived into what's called synarchism. And the leader, the originator of the philosophy of synarchism is a guy named Alexander Saint-Yves d'Albert, a French mystic. And what he claimed is that there was a realm a civilization in the Hollow Earth, and they implemented a political system which he called synergism, and he believed that that was, not capitalism, not communism, not anarchism. Synergism was the system for humanity, and as a system because they were in contact with the gods from whom they received instructions. So this Agartha, as he called it, this Hollow Earth, we have to remember that it's not an accident that it's related to the concept of Yuj and Majuj, who supposedly live underground. It's related to the similar civilization called by Shambhala by H.P. Blavatsky. So Afghani is the link to all these people. So in fact, maybe I can share my screen and show a picture of the several guises of Jamal Afghani. I'll just need a second. So this is the chapter, if anybody's interested, about Ibn Taymiyyah and his links to Jelani, Shir Qumah. This is an example of the anthropomorphic doctrine of the Shir Qumah. So this idea of God as a man is crucial because that takes us all the way up to transhumanism and the computer as Golem. Mm-hmm. So Jamal Afghani, if we go to here, I believe, or actually, let's go to...
It's volume 1, yeah.
Yeah, it's volume 2. So there's 2 chapters that cover it. So the Occult Revival. This talks about H.P. Blavatsky. That's Jamal Afghani. Do I have a picture of him? No, I don't. Not here in my other chapter. Here he is. So this researcher named K. Paul Johnson, he's done a lot of research. So H.P. Blavatsky, I hope you're familiar with her already. She's considered the godmother of the New Age movement. Her books have been referred to as sort of scriptures of Freemasonry. She's really the one who shaped modern occultism. She's the one who gave birth to the idea of not the more occultic version of the Aryan race adopted by the Nazis. And so she claimed to have been in touch with these hidden masters from Shambhala, these basically jinn, shayateen, who claimed to be, ascended personalities. And so K. Paul Johnson, he tries to search through all of there's several hidden masters that she names, and he believes that they were actually real people, and he tries to track them down. So one of them, he identifies Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, who is a famous Algerian political hero. He was also Freemason, friends with this entire network. And the other one is Jamal Afghani. So Jamal Afghani, to give you an example, he was very good friends with at least 2 people close to Blavatsky. One is James Sunua, who was a Jewish actor, and his girlfriend, Lydia Pashkov. These were both disciples and friends of Blavatsky. Jamal Afghani was also Grand Master of the Egyptian Freemasons, and his disciple is a guy named Muhammad Abdu, who you probably heard of. Mm-hmm. They used to refer to themselves as Ikhwan as-Safa wa Khulan al-Marwa. So that was obviously a deliberate, literal reference to the Brethren of Sincerity. So they saw themselves as being the modern revival of the Brethren of Sincerity. This because Afghani would have purportedly been the head of what was called the Brotherhood of Luxor, and that was a Hermetic brotherhood that supposedly came from Egypt and represented the survival of those Hermeticists that had taught the Templars during the Crusades. So that's basically where Afghani was placing himself in this Masonic tradition. That, you know, the Freemasons had survived in the West. He represented, you know, the forefront of the tradition that has survived in the Islamic world. And so when Saint Yves Dalvedre claims, the person that he claims to have introduced him to the doctrine of synarchism is this guy here on the left, which is Haji Sharif, a guy who refers to himself as Haji Sharif or as an Afghan prince. You can see that it's just Afghani in a different disguise. So this is now, these parallel tracks, these two tracks is really how Islam, so this is where the Muslim Brotherhood comes from and Nazism comes from. So the synarchists are active in Russia primarily. There's so many connections, I can't go into all of them. Basically, it's all tied to Rosicrucianism. This is Saint Yves Dalvedre. This is his wife. She was a good friend of Louise of Hessen-Kassel, who was the wife. I'll just touch on these briefly because all the details in my book, but just to give you a clue of what you can look further into. Friend of Louise of Hessen-Kassel, who was the wife of Christian IX of Denmark. He was a direct descendant of Charles of Hessen-Kassel, I think grandson or great-grandson, who was a Grand Master of the Asiatic Brethren. So the Asiatic Brethren are crucial because one thing we didn't touch on in this story is the Sabatian cult. So the Rosicrucians orchestrated the advent of Shabbatai Zvi in 1666. And that's the movement that basically slowly began to hijack Judaism, were responsible for the foundation of the Illuminati. They were also responsible for the foundation of this society called the Asiatic Brethren, which is a Sabbatean secret society and an Illuminati front, founded by the cousin of Jacob Frank. His name was Moses Dobrushka. So all the descendants of these families, they all descend back to Christian V of the Palatinate and Elizabeth Stewart, and it's all their descendants who become the active participants in the conspiracy. It's their descendants who form a family tree of which Queen Elizabeth is the leading heir. And so the various people involved here are Frederick the Great, as I mentioned, Charles of Hessen-Kassel, and the Dukes of Orleans, who become the leaders of the French Revolution. So here, this chapter, I show their intermarriage with the children of Queen Victoria and the House of Romanov. So the House of Romanov is very much an occultic branch as well. And so this is where you get the formulation of the Protocols of Zion. And the Protocols of Zion are then used by the Nazis as their scapegoat, to scapegoat the Jewish community and to blame the communist conspiracy on the quote-unquote Jews, when really it was these heretical Sabbatians that were orchestrating it. So to get back to Afghani's main pupil, so the Afghani and Abdul are referred to, as we mentioned this before, as revivalists, and they're the ones who basically revive the approach of Ibn Taymiyyah of calling for a reopening of the doors of ijtihad. And so Afghani's excuse was that when you look at the Islamic world is a state of collapse, and it's largely, he blamed it on the closing of the doors of ijtihad. He said that because of that, we weren't able to adapt Islam, and which is precisely what he wanted to do. There's an interesting quote. Afghani was quoted saying once he visited Paris, he said that you don't destroy Islam you don't destroy religion without the sword of religion. So he said, when you look at us, we do everything that's expected of a pious believer. We pray, we do Hajj, we fast. You know, he's a Luciferian who consciously, deliberately takes on the garb of a pious Muslim in order to destroy Islam from within. And this is why
it's like a fifth column destroying like an army within, right? Like a fifth column. Right. Yeah.
And so their main approach of attack was to question ijtihad again. And this is the basis of revivalism, and all based on a revival of Ibn Taymiyyah. So his pupil is Muhammad Abdu, who teams up with Lord Cromer, and they start basically, through the University of Al-Azhar, they start basically rewriting Islam, allowing banking and insurance and all kinds of, loosening of rules, which basically allowed the full infiltration of British colonialism, beginning in Turkey. Interestingly, Afghani was also linked to the Young Turk movement, which was a Sabatian movement, a Domne movement out of Turkey, out to destroy the Ottoman Empire. And Muhammad Abdu's pupil was Rashid Rida. Rashid Rida's pupil was Hassan al-Banna, founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. So Hassan al-Banna himself said that that the Muslim Brotherhood followed a Sufi track, and he basically claimed that the Muslim Brotherhood was Sufi and Salafi. So this is how, according to a researcher, this is John Loftus, who's a well-known Nazi hunter kind of researcher. He's done books like on the history of collaboration between IBM and the Nazis and topics like that. He's also researched the history between Muslims and the Nazis, and he claims that he was given access to the CIA archives, and he found proof that Hitler had commissioned Hassan al-Banna to found the Muslim Brotherhood. What is true is that the Muslim Brotherhood had very close links to the Nazis, because when the British had basically when the Muslim Brotherhood had tried to kill Nasser, Nasser's government basically interrogated them. They rounded up the Brotherhood, interrogated them, which means they tortured them, and they basically discovered that the Brotherhood was basically through and through a German operation, that it was at the disposal of pretty much any intelligence organization worldwide, but it was principally run by the Germans. So I'm not sure how much time we have left, but the topic
we have
time.
Yeah. Okay.
And also, it's David, just to kind of also pinpoint that it's interesting that bringing this history up, and especially for the Muslims to see for themselves. But I'm not sure if you are aware that also Sheikh Umar Ibrahim Wadilo, I think he wrote a book a few years back as well. I think Esoteric Teachings in Islam, something along those lines. This is almost like a 1,000-page book. He actually, references a lot of what you have stated as well. So I know we need to be talking more about it, but at least, there's someone in the Muslim world, including yourself and, a few other people who are basically going to their roots and talking about these things, right?
Yeah.
And he also spoke about actually Muhammad Iqbal and Muhammad Ali Jinnah as well. Maybe later on, if you know anything about them, you can probably shed some light as well.
Yeah.
From Indian subcontinent, if they are related somehow to these occult movements.
So I just want to go back to the Muslim Brotherhood, because what you're outlining it's very surprising. It would be very surprising to our viewers as well, about the Nazi connection to the formation of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Because when you originally said the Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, I was thinking, oh, maybe you're talking about the Wahhabi Ikhwan. But then when I went back to that interview that you had did recently, you mentioned Hassan al-Banna. I go, okay, this is very interesting. I never heard this ever before. So I don't know if have you ever looked into the motivations of this, because could have been just a strategic thing where they align them with the Nazis to get support, so they can kind of grow in Egypt. I don't. Can you comment on that, or?
Because initially, because I think the context also has to be realized that Ottoman were before Nazis obviously were also aligning with the Germans. So maybe there was a connection there in terms of the Muslim alliance with the German during World War I, and maybe you can shed some light on that as well.
Yeah.
David?
Well, that's a different period of Germany, right? That was in World War I, so it was a different Germany. It wasn't Nazi Germany then. So I mean, motivations, only Allah knows motivations, right? I don't spend my time trying to figure out why people do things. I think this is a very important point. You know, I don't try to figure out who's good and who's not good, because we don't know that.
Yeah.
Everybody's a degree of good and not good. Only Allah is the judge. What we have to do is we have to protect Islam. We have to advance Islam, and we judge people according to their adherence, right, to the purity of their implementation of Islam. And so, regardless of whatever their intentions are, it's what did al-Banna believe in, who did he align himself in with, and what was he up to, and what purpose did he serve? And it's the same thing with the Wahhabis, right? It's not we can't necessarily. The best way to criticize them and to effectively attack them is to just look at their teachings, regardless of what it is you can say about the people involved, or the character of Abdul Wahhab or the Saudi family and things like that. It's doctrinal. So it's the same thing with the Salafis. I cannot explain. I mean, at least for a guy like Afghani, we have it from his own mouth what he was trying to do. Somebody like al-Banna, I don't know what level of the ladder he was on of indoctrination. I mean, this is like when you look at the assassins, how their indoctrination worked. They were actually able to recruit pious Muslims and turn them into Satanists in grades, right? So first you get them to come into the religion, and then you get them to doubt certain tenets. Oh, well, the truth is actually a Sufi truth, and everyone's against it, but the reality is that this is the truth. Then you go one more rung up, and it's like, well, of the Sufis, there's actually this teacher in particular who's the one who really taught the truth, and all the other ones are lost. You go one more rung up, until finally, you're told that everybody thinks that the creator, that we're supposed to worship the creator, but actually the creator is an imposter, and we're supposed to worship, Satan is the true God. Right. So what level of that ladder are these guys on? I have no idea. Right. We're not gonna know. But that's not, like I explain to people, like, the purpose of this research is not to find people to blame. It's to identify the lie. It's to identify the deception so that we can free ourselves from the deception. Our concern is not to round these guys up and bring them to punishment. Our goal should be to elucidate the deception that we've suffered, to show how you guys are seeing how we've been colonized, and to decolonize ourselves, to free ourselves from, because we've been deceived through Islam, right? We need to uncover these masks and then figure out, because the answer is going to be by rediscovering our scholarly heritage. We need guidance on how we're supposed to act in this time. And for that, we need our books. But right now, we have nobody who can give us access to those books. It's one thing to be able to read them, but somebody has to have the depth of knowledge to know the range of material and to be able to formulate guidance out of those. So the first thing we need to do is we need to develop scholars. First Muslims have to recognize that they've been fooled. That we have to separate ourselves from this this nonsense that we've become immersed in recently, that we need to return to the madhab tradition and then start developing scholars. That might take decades or years. I don't know how long it takes to become a scholar of that. To develop a community as well too. It's one thing to have one scholar who's going to be able to have enough knowledge to be able to begin to start giving some guidance. But what we need is a community of scholars who can study a range of books and to debate and start to feed off each other and start to redevelop, this leadership, because that's what it is. It's leadership. Right? You can have political leadership, but you always need scholarly leadership. When the Quran says, ask that when the group go forward to jihad, that some remain behind to study. Right? You can have leaders leading the battle, but you always need a group that are there to preserve the religion, to continue to investigate, to formulate the laws, so that when the community comes back, they have a resource available to help them formulate, understand, their obligations and responsibilities.
Brother David, you would also agree that for scholarship to be sustained, there has to be the environment that's conducive to it, right? And we lost that environment that did try to help sustain that, right? So we had, like, for example, we no longer have that Islamic system that started from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and continued on with the rightly guided Khalifas. And at least after that, at a minimum, you still had that system, right? That existed until, so this is part of the decolonization process, is that the only way for, I guess, these, for the systemic way, and I'll include secularism, to exist is to suppress that, that scholarly tradition, that kind of truthful kind of living, right? And it's that, and it's interesting. It's the way these occultism, how it manifests itself is actually within societies, right? Within these secret societies, and the counter to that is to, kind of bring Islam on a societal level, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting. In one of your interviews, you said that we practice Islam as it's dual, like it's like like
personal
personal, but we in society we're somewhat
communal.
We don't want to kind of help change society or have it on a societal level, right?
Yeah. Exactly, and that's I blame Salafism for that. That's what they do, right? Because they turn it upside down. So there's it becomes a personal belief system, and that piety is achieved through ritual. There's no context. It's not. Yes, ritual is how you purify and better yourself so that you can become a better citizen. There's no Islam without community. Humans live as communities. Islam is a set of rules to help you govern ourselves. It's just common sense, and it's absurd that we even have to make this case.
It's definitely the case. I mean, the thing is, now we have limited Islam just to the rituals, and not looking at Islam as a comprehensive deen, but just as a madhab, right? Because obviously, Islam has all its systems, economic, social, political, judicial, how to actually organize a community, right, and live as one ummah. Whereas now, as long as you just, pray 5 times and go to Hajj, that's all you need to do. And then you basically absolve yourself and achieve salvation by just doing the 5 pillars. And forgetting that these 5 pillars are there to basically build a whole community around them.
Absolutely.
Right? And they serve as a foundation, not the end in itself.
And the world.
And the world, exactly.
So, I mean, that's the point, right? Just like we have this conspiracy, there's no other word for it, to establish a global rule of kufr.
I mean, it's interesting, Brother David, you said that, we, especially Muslims, tend to shy away from the word conspiracy. And then in the beginning of the conversation of the podcast, you mentioned that basically, Shaitan said, give me till, end of time, day of judgment. And I'll basically make sure they go astray. So hence, basically, Shaitan is conspiring, and the Quran is explicit about that.
That's right.
That Shaitan is an active plotting, and is conspiring and plotting against you day and night. That's right. So if anything, so Allah has given us the roadmap, or telling us, hey, there's a conspiracy against you, against the believers, not against the humanity at large. For obvious reasons, but specifically, there's a conspiracy against the believers. So, if anything, I think we should not be shying away from this word. We should be basically adopting it and live by that worldview. That the world is against us. Yeah,
exactly. Because you look at how many times is trying to talk about plotting, their secret plots, and they're meeting at night, and that could easily have been. Probably should have been translated as conspiring, because that's what it is.
Like the Yeah, the Quran says, like, I'm just paraphrasing it, like, they plan, but Allah
The perfect
plans.
planners.
So that tells you the importance of how planning is very important, right? And so the enemies of truth, are planning all the time, but we're not planning. We're just letting them
Flailing
plan for
around,
us.
holding YouTube debates, and But that's the thing is, I mean, there's only one threat to this conspiracy, and that's people unified around the message of Islam.
Right.
That's it.
Correct. Yeah.
So why are we hearing from all directions, attempts to try to deny the validity of that approach, to deny the importance of a state? It's all coming from the same sources, right? It's all,
Yeah.
you just look, open the first page of the book, see where it's published,
Yeah.
and you'll see. I mean, there's a reason why that whole debate is being sidelined.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's the one answer. That's what its life is. That's why this message was revealed. It's a wake up call for people to get together and recognize that that humanity needs to be united around the worship of the Creator.
Right.
Exactly. The next segment I like to go into is I would like to get your commentary on how to connect it to what's happening in present day. With the whole the COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdown, and now the whole vaccine agenda. If you can kind of provide your comments on that.
Yeah. So there's so much to study. The thing is, there's so much to. Well, we got a little bit of background, at least to see where this came from. In fact, this is a really important topic. This is why it's been so painful to me that I haven't been able to talk about this more with other Muslims, because we need to understand, in our situation, how this has been affected, because, this is where the source of the solution lies, and that's where the discussion needs to begin. But if Muslims want to begin to understand that situation, there's a lot to uncover. The too much to discuss in another few minutes, but just to give a brief list of the topics for consideration, we need to see the rise of Nazism that came out of Blavatsky, how Nazism basically survived after World War II, largely through the sponsorship of the CIA, how the CIA has basically operated in the dark, mainly through the support of Rockefeller oil money, which came from the Saudis. How the Saudis, of the many tangents, the Saudis created the Safari Club as a means to fund the CIA covert operations, and those were not just in the Islamic world, but basically supported almost any operation that covered the support to the Contras. That's where Iran-Contra came out of. Iran-Contra affair was basically a smuggling operation designed to raise money to support the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which again the Muslims were duped into thinking was a legitimate jihad. Fundamentally it was a Zionist operation against the Soviet Union. It's not the first time that Muslims have been lured into fighting a quote unquote jihad. The funding, the direct participation of the Muslim Brotherhood, of the Pakistani Secret Service, of other groups like Tablighi Jamaat in this operation to covertly fund this jihad. The rise of terrorism, recently, always funded by the Saudis, coordinated by the Muslim Brotherhood, mainly to corner the Muslims and to also give a false front to Islam. I mean, now that we've talked about it, we can see that what they're calling Islam has nothing to do with it. This is a sect that can be traced back to Ibn Taymiyyah, which has always been marginal. It had been marginal until 1932, when they began to suck the money out of the ground. So that was really part of a much larger network, like that the CIA and its funding of terrorism and the continuing links with the right, with neo-Nazis, particularly people like Francois Genoux. So Yusuf Nada, who was of what was the bank that he operated. He was connected to Francois Genoux, who was considered to have been sort of the treasurer of the Third Reich of the Nazi gold. Another guy named Ahmed Huber, who claimed to have converted to Islam, but he was also the member of Avalon Gesellschaft, another neo-Nazi organization. So because all those ties to neo-Nazis is part of what's called the Fascist International, and that seems to be really the conspiratorial body. A lot of they've maintained the illusion that it's a communist conspiracy, but it's actually a fascist conspiracy. It's linked to fascist organizations worldwide. I had to turn that off. It's linked to fascist organizations worldwide, and that's really the network. So basically, the umbrella group behind it all is a group called Le Cercle, and this is an organization created in the 50s, I believe, by one of the founders of Bilderberg Group. And this is the one organization which ties all the fascist organizations worldwide. Those that are responsible for like the Gladio operation. They also basically had close, a lot of this history actually begins in 1979, 1980, when Benjamin Netanyahu organized what's called the Jerusalem Conference. And this conference was composed of leading neoconservatives and leading members of Le Cercle. And that's when they had decided that they were going to make Islam or make terrorism the new threat. And of course, that coincided with the war in Afghanistan. So this is basically the core circle that has been conspiring, particularly the United States. They have created a number of organizations, principally like the Council on National Policy. And it's the people involved in that network who helped bring Trump to power, collaborating with Russian mafia, which is basically a Jewish mafia, which is basically a Zionist or probably a Mossad front, fundamentally, to get Trump elected. And you can see that for the last 4 years, Israel has had free reign to be able to do pretty much what they want. And now people are been, like, you read the news these days and all you hear about is COVID. It's pretty hard to find any real news in the news these days. So as far as framing what COVID is up to, I'm not sure what's going on. Biden, of course, is going to replace Trump. I'm not sure what the significance of that is, but we need to look beyond, I think, what is apparent short term and see the larger picture. Fundamentally, what they're trying to do, and this is one important factor that I'm trying to demonstrate in my book, is that they are using the Book of Revelation as a blueprint. And so they are trying to fulfill everything that is outlined in it. And that, of course, is to bring about the coming of the Messiah. So they believe that this is something that you don't just wait to see to happen. It's something that you have to actively bring about. So all of everything that's described as preceding the advent of the Messiah, they have, even if it means wars and destruction and famine and pain and suffering, they have to create those situations because those are the circumstances that will accelerate his arrival. And you'll see that most of what has been outlined in the Book of Revelation very much mirrors what is known in the End Times Hadith. So what seems to be happening is that there's orchestration between the evangelical right in the United States against the Muslims by basically encouraging Muslims to focus on the Hadith and the End Times, focus on their expectations for the End Times, which is basically a mirror image of the expectations of the evangelicals, potentially to bring about World War III in order to rebuild the third temple. And as you know, the third temple will have to be constructed on Al-Aqsa. So I think a lot of what Trump was doing was kind of preparations for this stage. This is why we find that a lot of right-wing Jews in Israel actually believed that Trump was the Messiah, or they believed that he was Cyrus, a repeat of Cyrus the Great, the competitor of Cyrus the Great. Because Cyrus the Great was the one who allowed the Jews to leave Babylon and return to Jerusalem, where they were able to rebuild the temple. So the entire goal of Freemasonry, the entire goal of this occult conspiracy is to rebuild the third temple. That's why they call themselves Freemasons, because they see themselves as Masons reconstructing the temple. That's why the Templars were called Templars, and it's core to the entire belief system. So the end goal, ultimately, that is the end goal. The end goal is to rebuild the third temple as a way to herald to accelerate the coming of the Messiah, or for when the Messiah comes. I'm not sure what the sequence of events is, but if these guys are to create the new world order governed by their expected Messiah, hence Dajjal, from the third temple, then that's ultimately what they're trying to do. Somewhere along the way, I think COVID fits into there. I think that COVID is a exercise. I'm not sure what other goals they might have, but I think this is the first, as I see it, exercise of global power.
Mm-hmm.
You see a fully world government coordinated, international media coordinated, all to a single cause. And this has been an important exercise to see to what extent, their consolidation of power can be effective. And I'm hoping it's just a short-term experiment, and that we're not going to see an attempt to impose their plans sometime soon, but we have to be ready for it.
So you're saying that the goal is just kind of make way for the Messiah that they want to kind of merge. So these, do you know if the people, like a lot of people who are on the top, who are very rich people, like, are they in on it, or are they just playing a part which they don't know where it's,
yes.
It's part of bringing, like, for example, like we have individuals like Bill Gates. I understand he has his family was involved in eugenics, but is he part of that plot, from what you know, or do you know anything on that, or comment on that?
I think there's very little doubt about that. So I'll read you. This is what David Rockefeller wrote in 2002. He said, "For more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents, such as my encounter with Castro, to attack the Rockefeller family. For inordinate influence they claim we yield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I'm proud of it."
Yeah.
So Bill Gates models himself. He was a friend of David Rockefeller. He models his career on David Rockefeller.
I see. Okay.
Right? So if you look at what Rockefeller did, and this is what a lot of people don't appreciate. So David Rockefeller is the grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the founder of the family. So John D. Rockefeller, he tried to monopolize the entire oil industry in the United States. And what happened is that the United States government instituted the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up his monopoly. It ended up that it served his advantage, that he actually became much more wealthy because of it. But what he did out of that then is that he turned to funding what are called tax exempt or charitable foundations. So that now he was able to spend his money for political objectives, largely by creating the Rockefeller Foundation, which, as I mentioned earlier, reorganized the educational system, funded the CIA, and get a tax credit for it. So if you look at Bill Gates' career, he did it almost exactly the same. He attempted a monopoly of basically, not the computer industry, but at least operating systems. And so to break up his monopoly, what the government used the same act as they did against Rockefeller. The Sherman Antitrust Act is what they had to revive to bring down Gates. Then what does he do to basically buy back his reputation? He sets up all these charitable foundations. The Rockefeller Foundation, as I mentioned, was one of two fronts that had been consistently used by the CIA through the century. One was the Ford Foundation, the other was the Rockefeller Foundation. I think you can be sure that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is probably a front of some kind of covert activity.
Mm-hmm. I see. I know I might be might change might kind of be changing a topic a little, but I know in some of your in your recent lecture, recent podcast, you mentioned that such as the American Revolution, the French Revolution, were all kind of orchestrated by these occult societies or groups.
Yeah.
So if that's have you looked at also other revolutions that may have not been so independent? For example, you had the have you looked at the Cuban Revolution? Was that a true people's revolution, or was that also somehow was there some occultic forces? I was just out of curiosity. I was wondering if you.
And also the Iranian Revolution along the lines as well.
Yeah. I mean, there's only so much time in my day.
we are going to have you.
I think we'll have to have you over again, and we can
absolutely.
Because I think we have gone a little over time, but just briefly.
But I mean, it's just like there's so many subjects to study. I just haven't had time. I've thought about those, and I just haven't had time to explore them. So right now you said you can't really comment on the. I'm very curious about the Cuban Revolution because that's my next area of research. But on the Cuban Revolution, you can't really comment right now. You're saying. I mean, who knows, right? I mean, there's some things. I have to be honest. There's some things that I find appealing about Castro's revolution. But Castro is actually it's a crypto Jewish name. He has Jewish ancestry. Mm-hmm. It's very curious that despite installing a communist society, right at the doorstep of the United States, that he became supposedly an archenemy. But of how many attempts did apparently the CIA carried out against him? Like 29, and they all failed. Right. Yeah. But then they can take down Allende in a month. They can take down Mossadegh in a month. Like. Something doesn't add up.
Mm-hmm. I hope it was a people's. I hope it was a true people's revolution, though.
Yeah, well,
I don't know. Let's see.
Sometimes there's probably some good in it, but the thing is, in the end, is it all good, right? We can only be satisfied with what satisfies God.
Right? Yeah, no, I agree. I totally agree with you. I mean, I'm not talking about ideologically. Ideologically, no way. What I'm saying is that. I was looking at, if I was more interested in the method itself. I could care less about the ideology of Castro. Right.
Oh, the method?
My area of research concerns if the way it was done, if it's possibly to be done in a true independent way. Now, right. if Cuban Revolution was just another revolution like the American Revolution, or the French Revolution, where there were outside forces influencing and supporting it, then that can tell you a lot of things, right? So, anyways, I've gone on a tangent, but that's fine. Yeah.
But our focus has to be like the thing is, the method evolves over time, right? We start with preaching, and then we see what happens. Like if you look at the case of the prophet, he starts with preaching, and then. Of course, that preaching is opposed. So then, under the circumstances, he had to adapt. And so the first thing that he decided to do was take his followers and take them to Abyssinia, Ethiopia. When things got better, he was able to bring them back. continued preaching, and then as things evolved, it became possible for them to carry out basically military operations. So I think we have to focus on what we have to do first. Problem is we can't preach Islam to the rest of the world because we're not practicing it. We need first to we first need to preach to ourselves. We need to preach to other Muslims and get them. This is an important point. There's a hadith, and I think exactly what's the number. It says if you're more than 3, elect an imam.
Amir, yes, exactly. Yeah.
We're more than 3.
Yeah. Brother David, I don't know if you've checked out our other podcasts. We've actually had a series on the methodology part on how to bring about the Islamic system, which you will find most interesting. So, but I'll share those links with you. We also, in our last previous podcast, we covered we covered vaccines, the topic of vaccines as well. So you would find that most interesting. But I think this was we could go on and on, but it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I really enjoyed listening to your findings on these various I guess plots in history, right?
Right.
Brother Ali, you want to?
No, again, I think Jazakallah khairan for your time, David. And at the end of the day, I think we need more Muslims, like yourself, who are basically, coming to the forefront with all these research, hopefully in the hopes that can aid us in terms of, revival, which is much needed. And also kind of wake us up from the deep slumber that we all find ourselves in. So I think, your work is much appreciated, and I hope that, Muslims are receptive and give ears to what you have to say.
Yeah. Well, I return to thank you guys. I'm so appreciative. It's a thrill after so many years to finally share this with other Muslims. It's been great who I've been able to share, but there's a certain affinity that's just not the same, right? When we share the same fundamental beliefs.
Right. I think definitely, being on the same, so to speak, wavelength goes a long way. Yeah. And I think, definitely we need to talk more and collaborate more and discuss these ideas more, because I know for probably a lot of our viewers, it was a lot to digest in, all the information. Yeah. But obviously we're going to leave the links to your website. Myself, Zishan, we're all going to go through it, and try to, especially, I think people have nothing to complain about, because you have almost 6 volumes of work available for free, without any copyright. So, end of the day, we have no excuse not to look into these things. And you seems like, you basically reference all your work as well. So it's not like, you basically talking out of your opinions. It's all evidence-based, and, people can go and check the sources and vet them themselves.
The only thing I would encourage, other Muslims is that if they look at the size, the amount of information that needs to be covered, it's a punishment.
Yeah.
It's a punishment for the extent of our neglect, right?
Right.
Muslims want to just sort of turn around tomorrow and, rally what the mosque and carry out, basically, transform Islam tomorrow. It's just not going to be that easy. We need to recognize the damage that's been incurred.
Yeah. I think you have to recognize the problem and the gravity of the damage and the problem before you can work on the solutions, right? Exactly. And sometimes we look at things very black and white and look at the solutions or the proposed solutions in the same manner, right? But it's not that easy. It seems like it nowadays, especially in the 21st century, you have more gray to worry about versus black and white. Yeah. And that's where I think our focus should be, to make sense out of the world we live in.
Right. Yeah, we have to expect it's to reconstruct what's been destroyed for several hundred years is going to take some work.
Right.
Yeah.
But definitely, I think part 2 is in the pipeline. Absolutely.
Oh, definitely.
If
it's okay with you, Brother David. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we'll give our viewers, some time to digest all the information, and perhaps inshallah, in a few weeks, we'll regroup and we'll go into, specific topics a little bit more in depth, inshallah.
That would be great, brothers.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair for that, Brother David. Again, for the viewers, we will leave the websites for David. The website's of David Livingstone, which is, I believe, 2 sites: a Facebook site and your main site, where they can refer to your work and your articles and the list of books that are available and published. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. Assalamu alaikum.